All right, I think we're going to get started. Thanks, folks, for joining us. Bear with me while I share my screen. So my name is Emily Scar. I'm PIRG's Stop Toxic PFAS campaign director. I'm also the director of Maryland PIRG. Really appreciate folks taking time out of their day to spend with us. Today, we're going to be focusing on stopping contamination of PFAS from industrial sources. You're going to hear from Kelly Moser, a senior attorney and leader of the water program with the Southern Environmental Law Center. Kelly will share her experience with industrial contamination on the ground in North Carolina, what they've learned, and how states can and should stop the discharge of PFAS at the source before the chemicals taint our waterways and drinking water. She's also going to point out what legislatures can do to make sure this happens through funding and oversight. And you'll hear from John Rumpler, who's Environment America's Clean Water Program Director and Senior Attorney, about legislative options states can take. And hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A, so please feel free to submit your questions throughout our presentations. But let's get started. I'm going to give some background on PFAS, which has been a growing concern in our states and country. So I'll give a quick overview, assuming a lot of folks who would join a call like this might already have some background. So hopefully it's not too repetitive. And then I'll turn it over to our speakers. Most of the content I'm going to share is from a white paper we did, The Threat of Forever Chemicals, which is a great resource for folks interested in learning more. This QR code actually takes you to that report. So I'd encourage folks who want the sources on anything I'm saying or more comprehensive information to look at the report. And while today we're focusing on industrial discharge, I'm also going to lay out our broader platform on PFAS. And before we get started, I also just wanted to recognize and thank a lot of our partners who have been so instrumental in this work in Maryland and across the country. In addition to the Southern Environmental Law Center and Environment America, I work closely with a lot of state and national groups, including Clean Water Action, Safer States, the Potomac Riverkeeper and Waterkeepers Chesapeake, Natural Resources Defense Council, Earth Justice, and the Environmental Working Group, just to name a few. So thank you all for the work you're doing. I know a couple of those folks were joining us today. So what are PFAS? PFAS are a class of more than 9,000 chemicals, and they're often used to make products grease resistant or waterproof. PFAS are called forever chemicals because they don't break down in the environment or in our body as they build up over time, which is a dangerous combination. This is very similar to lead, so we really want to do everything we can to both reduce contamination as quickly as possible, to reduce the public health impacts and the financial burden our states and communities will face to deal with the contamination and its consequences. You may have heard of toxic PFAS chemicals such as PFOA or PFAS that were used in Teflon back in the day. And they're also used in a whole host of other products. I have a couple of examples here. My dentist was sad to learn that they were in dental floss, but he's been very active with his dental society about getting other chemicals out, which I thought was interesting. And then the thing that obviously makes this a concern is that they are hazardous to our health. Almost all Americans have some level of PFAS in their bodies, which due to their widespread use in manufacturing and in consumer products. CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention survey found at least one PFAS in the blood of every single of the 2,000 Americans they tested. And what PFAS do is they bind to the tissue like proteins and accumulate in our blood, liver, kidneys, and brain. There still obviously needs to be more research on some of these implications, but PFAS exposure have been connected to increased risk of gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, low birth weight, thyroid disruption, harm to the kidneys, leading to chronic kidney disease or kidney cancer, liver disease, reduced antibody responses and vaccinations in both children and adults, testicular cancer, higher levels of cholesterol, increased risk of type 2 diabetes in women, and weakened immune systems overall. And the way we are exposed to them, I sort of mentioned earlier, is through all sorts of routes of exposure. We can be exposed to PFAS in drinking water, in food and food packaging, and in consumer products. Some occupations like Firefighters and active military are at increased risk of PFAS exposure. Let me remember what I have on my slides. Oh, I don't have it. There it is. So some professions like firefighters and active military and their families are at increased risk of exposure. Children are also at increased risk, both because of their smaller body, a smaller amount of PFAS could cause more harm, but also because they're likely to be exposed to a lifetime of exposure. But ultimately, PFAS put us all at risk. So to talk a little bit about what we do know about contamination across the country, we don't know everything because most states don't require testing, but the sampling that's done, we can leads us to some conclusions. PFAS are likely present in all major drinking water systems across the U.S. and almost certainly in all drinking water systems that use surface water. In 2022, there was a nationwide study of U.S. surface waters finding 83% that were tested were found to have PFAS. Testing has also found widespread PFAS contamination in groundwater. A 2022 study focusing on just the eastern United States found PFAS in 60% of the public supply wells and 20% of domestic wells. Testing has also found massive contamination on military sites due to the use of PFAS firefighting foam and training, and this is where we probably know more about contamination than a lot of other places. A 2021 Department of Defense study found that the Pentagon had served contaminated water with PFOA or PFAS to 175,000 military personnel over 24 facilities. And the Environmental Working Group has done more research into PFAS and military sites, saying that the numbers are likely much larger, exposing more than 600,000 personnel at 116 sites. EWG has identified more than 400 DoD sites with known PFAS contamination in either their groundwater or drinking water. This is certainly a big issue in Maryland, and there are sites you can look at if you're not familiar with the military contamination in your state. For food, there has been less research on PFAS in food, but we do know that there's contamination tied to the use of PFAS contaminated water to water crops and farmland, the spreading of sludge on farmland, and the exposure to both produce and animals to this contaminated water and food. In 2018, the FDA did some sampling of produce grown near PFAS manufacturing sites and found 80% were contaminated with PFAS. And PFAS has also been found in meat and fish. There was a 2020 analysis of finfish and shellfish from 4 regions of the U.S. and 7 countries with big seafood imports into the U.S., which found about 1/3 of these samples were contaminated. And this has led some states to issue fish and hunting advisories because of PFAS. So this is a big problem, and addressing PFAS contamination is going to require a comprehensive approach. I wanted to highlight PIRG and Environment America's platform on this issue and some of the things we've been focusing on. First, that we need to regulate PFAS as a class, all 9,000 chemicals. We can't be playing whack-a-mole, identifying and restricting one chemical at a time. Second, we want to phase out the production and use of all PFAS. Third, we're pushing to adopt measures to stop PFAS contaminating our waterways, groundwater, and food, which is what we're focusing on today. We want to make sure we're holding polluting industries accountable for the pollution and public health damage they have caused, which is key to number 5, ensuring that we have a comprehensive cleanup of existing PFAS contamination. And many states are making significant progress on these other points of our platform, particularly restricting use, to stop any new contamination. Maine has set a new law to phase out all uses of PFAS by 2030, and dozens of states are taking other action to restrict PFAS in specific uses from firefighting foam, food packaging, textiles, and other products. But again, we're going to focus on the narrow aspect and of the overall work that needs to be done. But if you do have questions about other policy areas or looking for support in your state, please reach out and we'll be happy to do our best to connect you with the right organization and experts that can help support you. So I'm going to turn it over to Kelly next to talk more about her experience in North Carolina. Kelly, I'm going to stop sharing and let you take over.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my slides? Emily, if you could raise your hand and let me know if you can see my slides, that'd be great. Okay. So nice to be with you this afternoon and to be able to talk to you about this important issue. Just a little bit of background about the Southern Environmental Law Center. We're a nonprofit environmental law firm representing environmental conservation, environmental justice, and community groups. We work in 6 states across the Southeast region, and we're involved in a variety of environmental issues from air issues, wildlife issues, and water issues. So today we're going to be focusing on some water issues and some really important water issues. And I am located in North Carolina. And we in North Carolina have sort of felt like we are on the battleground for fighting PFAS in our waterways. We've been involved in the fight against PFAS in North Carolina and across the region, and we know firsthand the importance of using existing tools under the Clean Water Act to protect drinking water and the families and communities that rely on it. Okay, so a common misperception is that we don't have legal tools to control PFAS, and that is simply not true. We have legal tools that already exist under the Clean Water Act to ensure that these chemicals are kept out of our waterways and drinking water. So the Clean Water Act, as you can see, has a really clear and simple mandate. It prohibits the discharge of pollutants or pollution except in compliance with the Act. And so for the discharge of industrial chemicals like PFAS, that authorization is typically in the form of a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. That's a mouthful. So today I'm going to use the term NPDES permit or a discharge permit. And to get a discharge permit, a discharger, like an industrial facility or a wastewater treatment plant, is supposed to tell the permitting authority, typically the state, sometimes EPA, and the public what chemicals they will likely release into the environment. So the process is supposed to go like this. Number one, an industrial facility or wastewater treatment plant tells the state and the public what it expects to be in its discharge. Number two, the state evaluates whether the pollution will harm the environment. And number three, the state issues a permit with controls, existing controls under the Clean Water Act, so that the pollution does not exceed the levels that are harmful to the environment and to public health. What this process means is that a state can and should regulate PFAS now without having to pass any new laws and without having to wait for EPA or Congress to tell it how to handle these discharges. We already know how to handle these discharges. But unfortunately, the current law hasn't been followed for PFAS, at least not consistently. And industries and industrial facilities have not told the state or the public when they are discharging PFAS. And so the state is not able, in some instances, to know where the PFAS contamination is coming from when they detect it in our drinking water. The result is we find it in our drinking water. We don't know where it comes from. And a lot of work goes into identifying those sources and cleaning up a mess. So a lot of the work that we do here at the Southern Environmental Law Center is focused on the difficult process of identifying the sources of PFAS pollution after the fact, once it's already in the environment in our waterways, and urging the states and municipalities to control that PFAS pollution before it goes into our water. And I will describe some of that work in just a minute. So you heard from Emily the various ways that PFAS can get into our environment. It is produced in a myriad of different industries, textile companies, metal finishing, chemical production. And when these industries are in our communities, They release PFAS pollution through their air emissions and their wastewater, and it ultimately into our waterways and our farm fields. Once PFAS are in our water or in our fields, they can also end up in the water we drink, the fish that we eat, and the food grown on our farms. And so today I will be focusing on stopping PFAS pollution from the source before it is discharged into our waterways. I'll be talking about controlling PFAS pollution that comes directly from industrial facilities into our waterways. And I'll also be talking about the PFAS pollution that is sent indirectly from those industrial facilities through their wastewater into wastewater treatment plants, many of which are not currently designed to remove PFAS. So with the state of things, if a state does not impose limits on industrial and wastewater treatment plant discharges of PFAS, PFAS is just discharged untreated directly into our waterways. We have direct experience with that type of pollution, as well as the public harm and cost that it causes. Indeed, one of the biggest environmental crises that North Carolina has ever experienced relates to PFAS. So back in 2017, the people of Wilmington, North Carolina woke up to this headline. And if they were like me, they were probably enjoying a cup of coffee made from water in their tap. And upon reading this, they likely realized that they had just taken a big sip of PFAS and that they had probably been doing it for years. So the backstory here is that Chemours and DuPont before it had been secretly releasing PFAS into the Cape Fear River, which is the drinking water source for over 500,000 North Carolinians. It caused downstream drinking water utilities to have to spend over $2 million to remove that PFAS from the drinking water. And Chemours contamination polluted at least 9,000 private drinking water wells, including those over 100 miles from the facility. SCLC sued Chemours because of how dangerously high their pollution was, and we sued North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, our state environmental agency, because it was not using the tools available under the Clean Water Act to control that pollution. Because of those lawsuits, SCLC, our client Cape Fear River Watch, the state of North Carolina, and Chemours got together and entered into a consent decree that required Chemours to reduce its PFAS pollution by at least 99%. To achieve this, Chemours had to install technology that effectively removes PFAS and obtain a clean water NPDES permit to control its discharges. Our consent order did not dictate the terms of the NPDES permit. The state ended up going above and beyond what the 99% required under the consent order and used the tools it had available to it under the Clean Water Act. So a little bit about Chemours' NPDES permit. The state did end up using its authority under the Clean Water Act at our urging and our clients' urging. It imposed strict discharge limits on the facility based on available technology. The technology that is available to remove PFAS from the wastewater. The technology that was incorporated removed PFAS as high as 10 million parts per trillion to almost non-detectable levels. That means that highly polluted wastewater with orders of magnitude PFAS levels higher than anything that we had seen was ultimately treated to non-detectable levels such that it could be released into the Cape Fear without harming the public or downstream communities. What we learned from the Chemours situation is that the Clean Water Act permitting structure can and does effectively regulate PFAS. It works. and the state doesn't need to pass new laws or wait for the EPA to take additional action. It has what it needs to control this PFAS pollution, and it should use that authority. Now, unfortunately, PFAS is not just getting into our waterways directly from industrial facilities like Chemours. It's coming from industrial facilities that discharge their wastewater to municipal wastewater treatment plants rather than discharging directly to surface waters. And you can see that in this figure. Municipal wastewater treatment plants are major sources of PFAS pollution. That pollution is coming from their industrial customers that have been using PFAS containing chemicals in their processes, and landfills that may have accepted waste that use PFAS containing chemicals. Conventional wastewater treatment plant does not effectively remove PFAS. If it is discharged into the sewer system by industries, it can just run right through the wastewater treatment plant and end up in our lakes, streams, and other drinking water sources. It also ends up in the solids from the treatment processes, often called sludge or biosolids, which is often land applied on our farm fields. And when it rains, the PFAS from those fields also get into our waterways, causing widespread PFAS contamination. Wastewater treatment plants, like states, also have the authority, obligation, and the ability to significantly reduce or even stop the pollution using their pre-treatment program under the Clean Water Act. When wastewater treatment plants fail to use their pre-treatment authority under the Clean Water Act to stop PFAS from entering their sewer systems, that PFAS enters drinking water. That's what happened when a wastewater treatment plant owned by the city of Burlington, North Carolina, failed to use its pre-treatment authority. And we in North Carolina experienced another PFAS crisis. The Haw River in North Carolina is drinking water supply for the city of Pittsboro, North Carolina, and several other downstream communities. For years, it was contaminated with PFAS flowing from the city of Burlington's wastewater treatment plant. Because Burlington failed to use its pretreatment authority to control its industrial customers' discharges into its sewer system, Burlington's wastewater treatment plant discharged PFAS into the Haw River at levels as high as 33,000 parts per trillion. Predictably, that pollution was detected in the drinking water for Pittsboro and other downstream communities, as well as people's homes, their schools, restaurants, churches, and businesses. Total PFAS concentrations in Pittsboro's drinking water supply have reached as high as 1,200 parts per trillion. And as a result, Pittsboro, the downstream community, a town of only 6,000 people, had to shoulder the cost of the pollution and was forced to install a $3.5 million granular activated carbon treatment system at its drinking water treatment plant. And while Pittsboro's drinking water treatment plant is now in operation, its installation has followed years of toxic exposure that led the small town or the people of the small town of Pittsboro to having some of the highest blood concentrations of PFAS in the country. In fact, the levels of PFAS in their blood were at the same level of the people in Wilmington who were subject to the Chemours contamination. So SCLC, representing the Haw River Assembly, threatened to sue the city of Burlington under the Clean Water Act. And because of that threat, the city of Burlington is now finally using its authority under the Clean Water Act, its existing authority, under its pre-treatment program to control its clients' PFAS pollution. If it had done so earlier, the citizens of Pittsboro could have been spared the harms of industrial PFAS pollution, and the city of Burlington could have been spared from the cost of identifying and controlling the sources of its the PFAS pollution in its wastewater treatment plant. So I just want to take a step back here, because when we started working with the city of Burlington, and they had no idea where the PFAS pollution was coming from. They knew they were receiving industrial facilities wastewater, but they had no idea which industrial facilities were sending wastewater to the treatment plant. It took years for the city of Burlington to figure out where the PFAS pollution was coming from. And when we entered into a settlement agreement with the city of Burlington, it finally agreed to use its pretreatment authority to require its industrial users to take steps to control their PFAS, either through product substitution, elimination of using PFAS, installation of treatment, or the capture of wastewater. Now, had Burlington only used its pretreatment authority, it would have known where the PFAS was coming from. It would have been able to stop the harm years ago. And after eliminating its pretreatment authority, as required by our settlement and the Clean Water Act, Burlington has brought the PFAS levels in its discharge to the Haw River down from 30,000 parts per trillion to consistently below 500 parts per trillion. And that's a 600% decrease. That amount will be further reduced dramatically now that the settlement agreement is finalized. Now, the stories I've told you about Wilmington and Pittsboro are just examples of what is happening across our state, across our region, and nationally. They also signify the success that can occur once states and municipalities use their existing tools under the Clean Water Act. Unfortunately, countless communities are experiencing the burden of PFAS pollution. And this could be avoided if only the state's wastewater treatment plants and industrial facilities use the existing tools that are available under the Clean Water Act. So out of concern for these failures, EPA in December 2022 released guidance instructing state agencies on how to address PFAS pollution from facilities like Chemours and wastewater treatment plants like Burlington using existing Clean Water Act authorities. The guidance explained that the foundational tools of the Clean Water Act could and should be used to control PFAS released into wastewater treatment plants and industrial facilities. We have the tools, they're just not being used. EPA's guidance instructs states to use the most current sampling and analytical methods in their NPDES programs to make sure they know which facilities are using PFAS and which facilities are discharging PFAS or planning to discharge PFAS into our waterways. It also instructs states to take action using their Clean Water Act pretreatment and permitting authorities to control that pollution before it causes harm like we saw in Wilmington and in Pittsboro. As the guidance makes clear, the Clean Water Act requires state permitting agencies to incorporate limits in on the discharge of PFAS based on what available technology can achieve. EPA is working on national discharge limits or national effluent limitation guidelines for many of the industries we know are responsible for PFAS pollution. But in its guidance, EPA emphasizes that states do not have to wait for those effluent limitation guidelines, because under the Clean Water Act, permitting agencies can set discharge limits and indeed must set discharge limits on a case-by-case basis based on the available technology using their best professional judgment. EPA's guidance also directs that permits issued to municipal wastewater treatment plants like Burlington's contain requirements to identify and locate all possible industrial users that are expected or suspected of PFAS discharges. And once the sources are identified, EPA instructs that municipalities develop local limits for PFAS or require their industrial users to implement best management practices or other controls to stop pollution, PFAS pollution at the source. And finally, EPA directs that wastewater treatment plants reduce the amount of PFAS chemicals that get into their biosolids and recommends analyzing biosolids for PFAS before they are ever land applied on our farm fields or make their way into the fish we eat or the food that we eat. So why is it important to control PFAS at the source? We focus on source control and requiring the industrial facility to control its own PFAS pollution because it prevents PFAS from getting into the environment in the first place. It's cheaper to treat 300,000 gallons per day of wastewater that may be discharged from an industrial facility than it is to treat 25 million gallons per day of PFAS-laden wastewater discharged from a wastewater treatment plant. It's also cheaper to prevent the pollution from entering our waterways than it is to have to install technology to remove PFAS at a downstream drinking water utility to make drinking water safe. It's the most fair result. It means that communities downstream of these polluters should not have to pay with their health or put forward hundreds of millions of dollars to install treatment technology at their drinking water source. And it avoids litigation and liability over PFAS once it's already in the environment. And once it's in the environment, we've seen that it is exorbitantly expensive to remove. So what can you do? I understand I have a number of state legislators on the call, and I also have river keepers and other community members on the call. And as I've already mentioned, the Clean Water Act provides the tools we need to control PFAS at the source. But there are things you can do to help with this work. Direct your state agencies and wastewater treatment plants to follow the EPA guidance and to comply with the Clean Water Act. For the river keepers out there and other community members, put pressure on your state legislators and your agencies to do the same. You can provide for state legislatures, you can provide oversight for your agencies, hold oversight hearings, make sure they are using their authority. If your state agencies are slim on resources, make sure that you can appropriate funds to make sure they have adequate resources to comply with the Clean Water Act and run their NPDES permitting programs. And in some cases, you may want to consider passing state legislation to make sure that these calls to order are clear and that the state agencies and municipalities are following the Clean Water Act and protecting the families and communities in your area from the harmful PFAS pollution that we've experienced here in North Carolina. And with that, I'm going to pass things over to John Rumpler to talk a little bit more about what can be done to control PFAS pollution.
Hey, thanks, Kelly. It's John Rumpler here, Clean Water Program Director at Environment America, based here in Boston. And thanks, Kelly and Emily, for that fantastic overview of both the problem and solutions at hand using existing legal authority. We are obviously, as Emily's presentation pointed out, the most important long-term thing we need to do is stop using these chemicals in the first place, right? And so they're not getting into our air, our water, our economy, and threatening people's health. But we're saying today that, we know that's going to take some time, right? Emily referred to the law in Maine, which is terrific, but the deadline is 2030. So, our thought for today is there must be a lot we could do in the state of Maine and other states that have moved to dramatically restrict the use of PFAS between now and 2030 to make sure it's not getting into our rivers, lakes, and streams. So that's one reason, just to reinforce what we're saying here. One is timing. At the same time, as we're working in the states to get at the root of the problem and stop the use of toxic chemicals, we're also working to do that at the federal level. Emily talked about the military and firefighting foam being a major source of this PFAS pollution. The good news is that we and our allies convinced Congress to order the Pentagon to phase out the use of firefighting foam at military bases. And now this fall, the FAA has finally designated a PFAS-free firefighting foam for airports. So we're seeing some progress at the federal level there. And of course, as Kelly indicated, Environment America and SCLC and many other organizations are pressing EPA to update the effluent limitation guidelines, at least for some industries. We would like them to do it for all, to dramatically limit, if not halt, the direct discharge of PFAS chemicals. But again, that will take time. The wheels of regulation at EPA do not move as fast as we would like them to. And this is why we all believe that you, as state legislators, have such a critical role to play now to rapidly halt the dumping of these toxic substances into our waterways. As Kelly laid out, state agencies that have the political will and leadership and resources could be just simply implementing existing authority under the Clean Water Act to say to all of these facilities, hey, you don't actually have PFAS as a designated pollutant in your NPDES permit, yet you're discharging, you're in violation, you have to stop right now. They could go and go to wastewater treatment plants and urge them to use their authority. And you can be exercising oversight to make sure that the agency is using this authority to the maximum extent under the law, which is just what the EPA memo that Kelly had on her screen urges state agencies to do. I want to just highlight that in some places, you might choose to actually legislate in addition to or instead of oversight. Why is this? Well, one is about speed and timing, that it might take a very long time for state agencies to execute the law at facility after facility after facility. That's one thing. Second is just the politics of your particular state, whether the legislature is a place where we're going to get more traction to be able to move this idea forward rather than the governor's office or the state agency. You know your state's best, but just putting that out there because time is of the essence. We don't want another 2 or 3 or 4 years to go by before a community like those along the Hawes River in North Carolina are getting toxic substances in their drinking water and in their morning coffee. A couple of other thoughts about why you might consider legislating. One is just we want to deal with PFAS in both direct discharges that an industrial facility is putting into its waterway and those indirect discharges at sewage treatment plants. Now, right now at sewage treatment plants, the authority is with the sewage treatment plant. They can tell the industrial facilities, hey, you have to monitor PFAS, and if there's PFAS coming to our plant, you can't do that, you have to pre-treat it. But to go after every single wastewater treatment plant and get them to exercise that authority, that might be a lot harder than simply having state legislation saying the pre-treatment standard for these perfluorinated compounds is 0. That any industrial facility sending its wastewater to a publicly owned treatment center must eliminate the PFAS before doing so. So that's just an example of how legislation might provide a more comprehensive, powerful way forward if it looks like a viable political path. Another thing that legislation might allow you to do is answer the critical question, what happens to all this PFAS once an industrial facility captures it in its waste stream. If they take all that PFAS and they're allowed to spread it on cropland, or they're allowed to incinerate it and then it goes up into the air, or they're allowed to landfill it and then it gets into the groundwater, we have all kinds of other problems. The state agency can use existing authority to regulate the direct and indirect discharges, but it may take an entirely different regulatory mechanism, which may or may not be available to your state agency, to stop the incineration, landfilling, etc. The beautiful thing about the power you have as legislators is you can do it all in one package, right? You can halt the direct discharge. You can prohibit wastewater, these industrial companies from sending PFAS in their wastewater to POTWs. You can tell them, hey, you can't incinerate or landfill this stuff. You can do that all in a piece of legislation. So those are some reasons that, again, if it is a politically viable path in your state, you might think about legislation as an option, in addition to, of course, ensuring that your state agency is exercising their full authority and, in fact, their obligation under the Clean Water Act to protect our rivers, our lakes, our drinking water, and public health. So let me just stop there. And Emily, let's see, let's open it up for questions and see how we can be helpful.
Great. Thank you both so much. I had one question. So I've been working on PFAS and toxic chemical exposure in Maryland for almost a decade, but I'm very new to Clean Water Act and water. So you both talked a bit about wastewater treatment plants not using their pretreatment authority. And I'm just curious if you, and I know that a lot of wastewater treatment folks are really worried about PFAS because they see the writing on the wall. They know they have a problem. One thing I think is we hear these horror stories from states that have large chemical industries. But the other thing I've learned is if you start looking, you're going to find it. Like Maryland is not a massive industrial state. We do have a lot of military, but, John and I were looking at that toxic chemical release inventory last year, and, industry in Baltimore is releasing PFAS. I don't know what they're doing with it, what they're making, but it's a lot of places. I digress. My point was wastewater treatment plants know there's an issue, but we also know they're not using their authority. A lot are concerned they're going to be financially liable, so much so that some are pushing for exemptions in federal law and state law. What's your sense on how they end up in this position? Is it a lack of capacity, like not knowing about the issue until it's too late? What do you think holds them back from using that authority? And
you want to take that, or
yeah. You can both talk.
I'm happy to relay kind of just some anecdotal anecdotes that we've heard on the ground. When we have approached wastewater treatment plants and reminded them that they have the authority under the Clean Water Act to stop industrial discharges of PFAS into their sewer systems, they say, we can't do that because if we do that, our industrial customers are going to move elsewhere. And it's interesting to me that that's the response. And it often reminds me that the purpose of the Clean Water Act is to have consistency, a baseline such that all wastewater treatment plants are doing the same thing, following the same law. And if that were the case, wastewater treatment plants wouldn't have to worry about a race to the bottom. They would be able to implement the authority that they're required to use and would not have to worry about wastewater treatment plants moving to another community or another state. That's one reason. And it just doesn't seem like a good reason to me. John, do you have other information?
Well, I guess what I would say, I think, remember, for an industrial facility to just entirely pack up shop and move to another place, usually there are larger considerations than just where's my wastewater going to go, labor, interest rates, employment, all kinds of other things. So to some degree, I don't even buy the argument that they're going to just pick up their stakes. I do think, though, that water utilities, remember, these are contracts, and the industrial users pay the wastewater utilities to take their waste. So they're going to lose that customer. It's not that the company is going to pick up stakes and thousands of jobs are going to be lost, but they're going to lose that revenue stream from that industrial facility. And because the water utilities are currently not regulated and required to do anything about their own PFAS discharges, it's just a net negative on their balance sheet when they lose that source of revenue. This may upset some, but I want to note that right now, wastewater treatment plants are lobbying EPA and Congress and elsewhere saying, don't impose regulation on us. We didn't cause the problem. We're the victims here. But, you know, when you look at this pretreatment and the fact that they're willingly accepting toxic waste into their systems, that's just baloney. So I guess my thing to the wastewater treatment plants, we hear you, you're public agencies, we should be on the same team. But if you're not exercising your authority to stop a public health threat, then you are as much a part of the problem as the chemical companies. Anyway, whatever the motive is, it's clearly not happening. This waste is still going to POTWs. It's ending up in our rivers and our drinking water, and it's going to be up to state agencies and state legislators to put a halt to this toxic dumping.
Yeah, no, that was very helpful. I hadn't thought of that customer business angle. I assumed it also has to do with just like similar to us. I mean, Kelly, thank you for all your work, but lawsuits take time and money. And so there's also that burden of them, like the legal requirements to hold their customers accountable. That makes total sense. I've got one more question. If folks have any more, please put them in. We do have time, but I'm hoping we can wrap up a little early. One thing that's come up is the question of disposal, right? And I think the important thing to keep in mind here, as you've all said, is this is not the solution to PFAS. We don't want to keep using PFAS because we have the technology to capture it or whatever. And so, as Kelly talked about, advances and really reducing contamination is good, but it's not a silver bullet. We don't know how to like get it down to zero fully everywhere yet. So the question is on disposal, what happens to, you know, the PFAS that is being captured and how is it disposed of, or do we have recommendations? John, I think that might fall on your purview. What happens to it before, you know, once it's captured from wastewater or from the facility itself?
Right. Well, let me start with some good news, which is that there is some emerging technology that suggests that there is a way to treat and break down PFAS over time. It's going to be very expensive. It needs to be scaled up to deal with these huge volumes of wastewater and so forth. But, you know, we may come to a point where we find a solution that is safe, albeit much more costly than preventing the problem in the first place. At this time, we don't know exactly what that safe alternative is. What we do know is there are a lot of really bad ideas about what to do with this stuff. As I was saying before, incinerating it so it goes into the air, not a good idea, as we saw from your slide. You know, landfilling it so it winds up in groundwater, also not a good idea, and so forth. And so ideally, I think what we would be saying to industrial facilities in an ideal piece of legislation or regulation is you have to take that PFAS captured in wastewater and either reuse it in your process to the extent you're still using PFAS, which we wish you weren't, or you have to store it on site safely and contained until the state officially designates a safe disposal technology, which we hope comes soon, but it's just not there yet.
Right. And that's like in Maryland, when we had the ban on firefighting foam, we had a take back program, and we, you know, to say you can't incinerate this, you can't ship this stuff out of state, you can't landfill it. But that's another good reason to say this isn't the silver bullet. There's a lot more to be done. So I really thank you both. I'll give you a minute. If there's anything else you wanted to add, feel free. But I think we're going to wrap up. No one's jumping. So we're going to wrap up.
Emily, I would just say that, you know, to the extent if anyone is, I didn't put up slides, but if anyone wants more information either about working on state legislation or oversight, at the state level, as well as weighing in at the federal level to get EPA to do more and faster. You know, my email, I'm jrumpler@environmentamerica.org. And Emily has her.
I'll put it in
email
chat
here.
for you, John.
And, you know, please reach out to us. And obviously, I don't want to speak for Kelly, but I assume she'd be happy to answer questions as well. You know, we're looking at this webinar as one moment in time, but we realize your legislative calendars for many of you are just about to begin. So we want to be an ongoing resource for you if we can help you stop this toxic pollution.
Great. Yeah, so we put our emails in the chat. I'll also be sharing around a recording of this video to the folks who are RSVP'd, and we're going to post it up on our website as well. So again, thanks everyone for taking the time. And it was really nice, Kelly, John, to spend an afternoon with you and talk more and learn more about the Clean Water Act and PFAS contamination. Take care.
Thank you so much.